Hi, this is Larry Jordan. The following interview was recorded January 14th, 2014 as part of my 4K and Final Cut Pro 10 seminar. Listen as Ian Andes, Vice President of Sales for G Technology, discusses the latest in storage technology. Ian Andes is the VP of Sales for G Technology, and I invited him here because there's a whole lot of questions that we have about storage that need to get answered. One of the things that we've discovered over the course of today is that the speed of our computer is far, far less important than the speed and the size of our storage. And if I were to invest money, investing money in high-speed storage is a far better investment than in getting the absolute fastest processor, because any processor right now is sufficient for doing even 4K video. Even on small computers, the gating factor becomes not the processor, but the storage, which is why I'm glad that you're here. Thank you for coming.
Thanks.
What determines drive performance? What makes a drive go as fast as it does?
It's a long answer. Okay, so there's a lot of different things that you want to take into account when you're choosing your drive. So at its most fundamental basis, it's not even the enclosure that you want to be looking at initially. You also want to take into account the physical hard drive inside of the enclosure. And again, it's one of those things, there are so many different factors that you want to take into consideration. So one of the largest factors when you're looking at hard drives is the platters and the amount of platters inside. Okay? So as technology progresses within hard drives, there's a bunch of different things you can do to the drive to either give you bigger capacity or faster speeds. So for example, long time ago, everyone kind of standardized on this 3.5-inch disk drive. So the disk inside, you can think of it kind of like a frisbee or a wheel. The size of that hasn't changed, yet the capacity of hard drives keeps getting bigger and bigger. There's only two ways to do that. Either what they call the areal density, or on any given portion of the hard drive, how many little blocks of data can you fit in that little portion? So either make the blocks of data smaller, that the drive can still read it, and you've increased your capacity, or add more platters. There's pros and cons to each, and this is some of the key stuff you want to look at. When you add more platters, it becomes more expensive. But as I think you were saying before, if you think of cars like a 4-cylinder versus an 8-cylinder, you're still fitting inside the car, but an 8-cylinder is going to be able to go faster and get you there quicker, in theory, than a 4-cylinder car. It's the same thing with a hard drive. The more platters you have inside, the more heads that are reading, the faster the throughput that you're going to get out of the drive. And then, at a certain point, like I said, or you can just fit more sectors on the same surface area of a hard drive.
Now, one of the things that I've heard that I think is a really cool concept, if it's true, is that the faster a drive rotates, the faster we can access data, but the less information it can hold. So if I have a 5400 RPM, it'll hold a lot of information, but I can't access it very quickly. 7200, I can access it faster, but it doesn't hold as much as, say, a 10,000 or 15,000 RPM. Should I care, one, about the rotation speed, and two, is that a true statement?
It's a really good question. So the amount of capacity that can hold is kind of a cheat question, because the amount of capacity that can hold is more indicative of, with a really good technology, as the drive spins, can the heads read the sector? Okay. Now, what some companies will do, and they'll get really clever with this, is if their technology hasn't, on that particular design, isn't fast enough to read that sector, they'll call it a green drive, say it's good for the environment, consumes less power, and just slow down the rotational speed. So for the most part, certain heads can read X amount of density on the drive. The rotational speed just depends on if their technology can read it fast enough. So it doesn't really have to do with slower will hold more. It has to do with slower can maintain that speed on that piece of technology. If that made any sense.
No, but I'll let you off the hook.
Did that make sense at all? Yes. Okay. So what you guys really want to worry about, which is I think the question you were asking, right? There's basically, for the most part, you've got some 4,800 RPM drives, but you're primarily dealing with 5,400, 7,200, and there's a lot of talk right now about a 10,000 RPM drive. So for video editing specifically, you start to see diminishing results on how many streams of video you can play back with a higher rotation. 5,400, if there's a lot of drives, The access time may be slower, but you can still get a pretty good amount of streams. Okay, 5400 is primarily a 2.5 inch, like a laptop drive size. On the 3.5 inch, which is the big buckets of storage, right? The more drives you have is going to be a little bit more important because you've got more cylinders helping that engine push out the data. So as long as you've got a 7200 RPM drive, you're okay. For video editing, I shy away from the green drives. Like with us, G Technology, we don't make one of those because we're very concerned with guaranteed performance. To go back to what you were saying before, it's 100% accurate. Even though the box may say 10 gigabit, a single drive isn't going to get you there. Okay? What we're worried about is sustained data rates. We want to make sure that in your edit, when you're 70, 80, 90% full on the drive, you're not all of a sudden going to lose a frame. 10,000 RPM, the amount of streams you can get, it starts to tailor off a little bit, like you're not going to get that much more. It's how many drives you have. You might notice a fraction of a difference from when you hit the spacebar to when it starts playing, but at that point, it's probably nothing to really make a big difference in you compared to the price that you're going to be paying for it. So 10,000 RPMs are really good when you want to access files instantly, your operating system type thing, but for a video editing environment, we haven't really noticed a big benefit.
Are Thunderbolt drives the same speed? In other words, if I buy a single drive that's got a Thunderbolt connection, are they all roughly the same speed?
So the drives inside won't change. The manufacturer is going to have their own technology that they put into the drive itself. So in other words, for a G-Tech drive, it's the same drive in a G-RAID as it is in a G-RAID Thunderbolt. So the port, you're not saturating the port, so the port's not going to make a difference in how fast it's going to go. We'll use the same drive. Where you start getting into a bit of a difference in the drives between the manufacturers is, let's say, on a 4-bay removable. Okay, and this might be interesting, right? So on a 4-bay removable, like we've got any removable drives, we'll use an enterprise class version of that drive. Now, enterprise class drives give you all kind of benefits. They've got a higher standard of manufacturability, which means they're designed to always be on 24/7. We use HDST drives, and ours are standardized for about 5 years. Okay, so on the drive itself, it's got a 5-year warranty. So you can go 24/7, always on environments, 5 years. The other interesting piece of technology that comes on that drive is anti-vibration. So if you think about it, one drive by itself, the platters are all contained in the enclosure of the hard drive, no problem, right? When you start stacking multiple drives on top of each other, like I don't know if you saw that old video, I was talking to some people outside where the bridge started to go crazy. They tried to drive a car on top of it to stop the oscillation. Well, if you can imagine, you've got heads inside of these drives spinning at 7,200 RPM. And I'll get into helium in a second, but the oxygen, there's obviously friction on that drive, so they're going to start to vibrate a little bit. Multiple drives stacked on top of each other, if they were to vibrate in a very specific frequency, it may cause the head to miss a read where the disk has to go all the way around to get the next read. Okay? 4K video, 2K, HD, whatever, that split second could actually cause you to drop a frame, stop your playback, well, for me it used to be laying it out to tape was a really big deal, right? Aging myself. But that's going to cause an issue on your timeline. So enterprise class drives are specifically designed for these massive array environments, and we take advantage of it in our enclosures. They won't allow that oscillation to happen, so it'll keep that vibration to a minimum, making sure that you're going to be able to read it every single time it goes around. And then to go back to one of the original points, the other big difference between multi-platters within the drive versus trying to pack all that density in, it's all going to be cost. One of the most expensive components of a hard drive are the platters and the heads reading them. So some companies will take the approach of, well, we want to bring costs down as low as possible. So we'll try and fit more into the same size with less heads and less platters. We kind of take a different approach where performance is much more important. So we'll have more platters with more heads reading them, but it increases the cost of manufacturing the product.
Couple simple questions. Should you ever let a drive go to sleep? And should you ever turn a drive off?
Okay. I think you've asked me this one before. Okay, so in today's technology, it's far less important. That question tends to come from some legacy technology. What used to happen, and if any of the tech stuff we talk about doesn't make sense, if you raise your hand, I'll know you want me to elaborate on what that means, and I'll try and answer that, okay? So what used to happen was you kind of have your cylinder, and then the heads, when they're not doing anything, needed a place to park. So what they used to do was they would go to the center of the drive and just park there because they don't want to scratch the surface if it dropped or if something happened, right? And then after a long time with gravity, and you're talking about these heads are floating above this hard drive with like nanometers. I mean, the space is unbelievable that they can even engineer this. They would drop just a little bit and get parked in this groove, and if long enough time passed, they'd get stuck. And you couldn't get enough juice through the drive to get that thing spinning again. Even though it wouldn't damage anything, it's called the flight height. They just couldn't get it to start flying again. That's all been taken care of with technology. These things are designed to be able to park, start up again, etc. The difficulty in answering that question is we'd have to produce like 100,000 drives, and every 3 months take 100 off the shelf, start them up and see if they started, and wait 10 years until we found that here's the curve where they no longer start anymore. But it's not a working environment, so it probably wouldn't be a good test anyway.
Aside from the energy savings,
Yeah.
just in general purposes, should we turn our drives off at night or should we leave them on?
You can put 1,000 people in a room. 500 are going to argue one way, 500 are going to argue the other.
So I've
So
got
if
one
power is
person
not
in
an
the
issue-
room, and I'm arguing with you. What should they do?
Okay, so I'm going to answer that in two parts. So there's this thing with Mavericks, in case you guys don't know about it, they've kind of changed the way they have drives hibernating. So they're going to kind of force hibernation after a while. Some traditional editors hate it. You can buy a $20 piece of software. It'll always keep those drives running. Purely from an environmental standpoint and the heat they put out and then the air conditioning in your room and the noise and all that, I turn mine off. So all I can do is tell you what I do. But again, I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth because then you can also buy a drive which is specifically designed to be always on 24/7 for 5 years without a problem.
So basically, it's personal preference and it doesn't make a whole lot of difference.
Doesn't make a difference anymore.
Why didn't you say that like 10 minutes ago?
I did, didn't I? I avoided the question. All right.
Wouldn't it extend the life if you're not going to work on a project for 3 weeks?
So the question, in case you didn't hear it, was, wouldn't it extend the life of the drive? To be honest, most people after 3 to 4 years take that capacity and dump it into a new drive anyway. And if they're designed for 5 years of use, are you really going to want, like today's 1 terabyte drive in 5 to 7 years, it's going to be way, way bigger, way, way faster. You're never going to go back to it anyway. So is it really extending the life? And again, that's the debate. There's no really good published data because we'd have to take thousands of drives, start half of them, leave the other half, and then see what the failure rate is. So having them spin all the time is going to keep the things, lubed and continuously going, but then having them off half the time and then restarting them, right, is going to have a different effect. So it 6 in one, half a dozen the other. Doesn't matter.
Question. If you have a drive you're not using with data on it, is it a bad idea to leave it on the shelf for several years?
Repeat the question.
So the question is, if you have a drive with data on it, is it a bad idea to leave it on the shelf for several years? Statistically speaking, for most part, it's the same thing as leaving it running. The likelihood of failure over just a couple of years isn't that big of a deal. Now, what I always tell people is if you have data on a shelf you absolutely need, I always have it in 3 places. Sometimes, with the old tape days, you can always leave it on a source, which degrades over time. But I've always got it in 3 places. I've got my usable copy, my on-site recovery copy, then my off-site disaster recovery copy. Because if there's a flood, if there's wood, I'd knock on it around here, being in LA with the earthquake comment, right? But if something happens and your place of residence or work, you lose everything, I like to have all my data in one off-site copy. Now, I'm also powered in enough to the point where, when I use photography, because it's my new passion right now, right? I'm a hack photographer. I consolidated all my data a couple days ago from my old USB 2 box to a USB 3 box, and I found that I had 38,000 images over the last 10 years. Of which, truthfully, if we're honest with ourselves, maybe 10 of them are good. Not 10,000, 10 photos. Okay, so those I'll put up in the cloud because then at least somebody else can take care of them for me. But other than that, everything else I have in 3 separate locations.
One of the things that we're doing with hard disks is we're starting to create what Apple calls a fusion drive, where we are combining solid state with spinning media.
Yeah.
Why do we want to think about doing it? What's the benefit of combining those two?
So I have to be careful in how I answer this, just so everyone understands under NDA and stuff. Full disclosure. So I'm not allowed to really talk about unannounced products.
No, I'm not asking about.
As to whether we may or may not be working on. So I just have to be a little careful. So, and is it okay if I start talking about SSD a little bit because they lend into each other? Okay, SSD.
Define that.
So solid state disks, so basically chips. Like, the easiest way I talk to people is imagine a bunch of RAM that maintains its data in a box. It's super, super fast. And a lot of people are starting to come out with SSD technology. And if I don't go back into it, remind me about Fusion because I will get there. So SSD inherently today has some limitations that a lot of companies don't necessarily want to talk about. So initially SSD came out and 256 gigs of SSD, which is amazingly fast, was a couple $1,000s. Great performance, super expensive. The majority of people didn't want to pay it. So they started taking out some of the cost of the SSD by eliminating features. Now, if you go back maybe 10 years...
Wait, back up a step.
Yeah.
Why would we even want to combine SSD with spinning media?
Okay, great. So spinning media is really, really good at high capacity, okay, and price points. SSD is really good at unbelievable speed. If you could somehow merge the two into one solution, you'd get the instant access, super fast 400, 500, 600 megs per second on a single SSD with the inexpensive nature of rotational disk media, which can store, on a single drive today, like HDST has a 6 terabyte drive. Merge those two, you get the best of both worlds.
And because you're not getting an all SD drive, you save money because you're just buying a small piece of SSD so that the overall cost, though larger than a spinning media by itself,
Correct.
gives you better performance without having to break the bank.
Correct. That's the theory.
So SSD accelerated spinning media would be an alternative to buying a RAID when the only reason you wanted the RAID was faster performance.
Yes, as long as there was enough room on the SSD from a video editing standpoint, right, to copy that data from the rotational disk for a long enough playback. So what I mean by that is, Apple kind of has this Fusion drive, which everybody loves. Because for the most part, once the computer's on, some of your programs are going to continuously need data. Move all of that onto the SSD portion, and it's going to be much, much faster boot. You're going to have faster access to your programs, but there's not a lot of transfer back and forth. The problem with video is it's not necessarily sequential all the time. So if you've got a very complex project, it's going to be pulling from all different areas of the drive. You have to be able to move the data from the rotational portion to the SSD portion quick enough to get the benefits. Where that has some potential issues is the failure rate on SSD typically comes from maxing out the read-write cycle of each essentially chip. So, like a little tidbit of information. SSD is graded on read-write cycles. So whether or not in the wafer it can read the positive or the negative. After X amount of time per chip on an SSD block, right? And you don't really need these terms, you get the general idea, right? It'll fail. And then once it's failed, it deletes that section, moves on to the next, you never get it back. So, as an example, a very cost-effective 500 gig SSD, might give you 60,000 rewrites. The best stuff is double the price, but you may get triple the amount of rewrites. Now, and you were talking about marketing before with, megabit, megabyte, and how to confuse everybody. This is another one of those scenarios. Everyone's so price point conscious, they're not thinking yet in terms of cost per read-write, how long is this thing really going to last? They're just thinking cost per gig like it's a hard drive and pretending they're equal. There's going to take some education time in the channel for people to understand that not all SSD is anywhere close to being equal.
One of the new things that came out with the Mac Pro is the Thunderbolt 2 port.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we see a difference in performance for the same drive connected Thunderbolt 2 versus Thunderbolt 1?
No. So you were 100% right when I heard you talking about that. The analogy I use all the time is that pipe. If my water hose can output this much, Thunderbolt 1 is this big, Thunderbolt 2 is this big, you're not getting any performance. There's no performance gain if the drive can't saturate the port. And I think you mentioned it, but this is critical for me and it drives me crazy. Because all these marketing people in these companies want to make sure no one's outdoing each other. So the industry's gotten into a really bad habit of advertising the port speed on their products, not the actual throughput, right? So for example, if I have a 2.5-inch drive, and you can see one outside, HGST technology, because of the RPM, so we're at 136 megs per second on our 2.5-inch drive. The rest of the channel is around 110. So to catch up with us, what everyone did was they said, well, no, we've got a Thunderbolt port, we're going to do 1,000 megs per second. That kind of leveled the playing field without really letting people know that when they get home, you're running at just over 1/10 of that speed, right? And what's even crazier is everyone's talking Thunderbolt. In that particular scenario, USB 3 is more than enough bandwidth to contain that drive, right? So for the most part today, only when you start getting to speeds where you're saturating Thunderbolt 1 do you want to go into Thunderbolt 2. There's one caveat to all of this, which is critical for everybody in the room. Okay, and I don't know if you go back to the SCSI days, but it's kind of like terminating a SCSI. So, and I noticed there's a couple Mac Pros outside, right? So as you start getting into Thunderbolt 2 technology, and if you guys bought a Mac Pro in the last 3 to 4 months, you may not know it, but it has Thunderbolt 2 on there. You want to be careful where in the chain you're putting your Thunderbolt 1 component, okay? So even though you're not saturating the bus, make sure that all Thunderbolt 1 ports are at the end of the chain as you daisy chain them. Because if it's the first component in your chain, you've taken your pipe of Thunderbolt 2 out of the system, gotten down to Thunderbolt 1, and then if you have Thunderbolt 2 ports after that, you've bottlenecked it at the source, so you can no longer get to the faster speed. Okay, so from a performance standpoint, there's no difference on the drives. Just make sure that, you know, if you go out and buy even non-hard drive peripherals, if it's Thunderbolt 1 at the beginning of the chain, you've truncated that chain at the beginning, just stick it at the end, and you get all your speed. My biggest concern in a real-world environment, are they shipping yet? But like, there's going to be a bunch of Thunderbolt 2 monitors, 4K monitors. So if you go from your system to a Thunderbolt 1 hard drive, even if it's not saturating, to a 4K monitor, which is Thunderbolt 2, you're not going to get enough data to that monitor. You want to go system, monitor, hard drive, and you'll be fine. Okay.
As I look around the marketplace, finding RAIDs which can actually saturate a Thunderbolt pipe is increasingly, was really, really hard. There was promise, then there was promise, and then there was promise.
Yeah.
Why is it so hard to get a RAID 5 released? Now we've got Erica, we've got Akidio, we've got Promise. There's a certain company I'm looking at that does not yet have a RAID 5.
Yeah. So a lot of that, for us specifically, just came down to timing. G-Tech had a lot of success at the beginning, and then we got acquired numerous times. So for me, this is what I tell people, without getting into the boring details, right? 2013, there was just some integration and some fixing we needed to do. 2014 is all about implementing those fixes. So we kind of had a decision for us specifically, and what our drives could already do on a Thunderbolt 1. You know, you take 2 G-RAIDs, you're saturated, you don't really need, some of the 4 bays and bigger. We wanted to make sure that we really, really leapfrog some of the technology. Without getting into details, the first half of this year is going to be really, really big for us, so you can expect some big stuff, but you'll have to wait. In terms of how come it's so hard, so Thunderbolt itself was a cooperative effort between Intel and Apple. They had a lot of learning curves that, they had to go through. And again, I can give you all the boring details later, but to release that kind of product is a monumental effort between a lot of different companies. And sometimes there are companies that are really, really good at taking early launch, trying to do the best they can to do things like saturate the bus, bring the cost down, etc. G-Tech has a bit more of a conservative approach. We really want to see what the technology is doing. Then once it's standardized a little bit, then go in and make the absolute best product that anybody's made with that technology. So we're not necessarily keen on being the first ones out because within the first 6 months of the launch of Thunderbolt, they went through 3 board revisions. Some of the old ones don't work with the new ones. You'll buy the exact same product from the same company. One performs much better because you happen to get the A stock versus the B stock. There's a lot of stuff that gets involved in it. So we like to make sure that when we talk to our customers, it's okay. We guarantee the performance. It'll be identical across our entire product portfolio, and you're going to have the best user case.
One of the focuses of today is looking at high resolution, Ultra HD and 4K media.
Yep.
What do we need to do? What storage do we need to consider to support that kind of media? What do we need to get?
Tough question. Okay, so there's a couple different ways to answer that. And it really depends on, let me say it this way. One of the first things I would recommend to everybody, especially if you're old school, forget about generation loss. This is something I talk to people all the time. There used to be this unbelievable paranoia in the industry. If I capture digitally, every time I do something to that video, my video quality is going to go down. Originally, the codecs, there was a lot of catching up that they had to do, right? And you would get this thing called generation loss. So people didn't want to do that. So everybody used to talk about, I can do uncompressed in XYZ format, XYZ resolution, XYZ color depth. To be honest, that technology has gotten so good. So you look at the guys, and I know there's some of them out there, so I'm not going to mention company names, right? Those companies have gotten so good with their compression technology. It's almost unfair that they call it compression. So I think, the industry's kind of standardized on a 3-to-1. So unless you're doing heavy, heavy compositing, lots and lots of generation with animation in the background, I wouldn't even worry about uncompressed. So let's say, for me, the easiest one's 4K. Roughly speaking, we're talking about 900 megs per second for a single uncompressed 4K workflow. In that case, you're usually going to need 4 to 6 disks in a box. We've got some interesting technology that we can talk about. But at the end of the day, all you really want to worry about is megabytes per second. A single stream, 4K uncompressed, 900 meg. However, the vast majority of people, we're talking Red, we're talking, every camera manufacturer out there is doing what? Maybe 3-to-1 is probably fair. All you need is 400 megs per second. Most 3 to 4 drive boxes can easily do that, if not multiple streams of video. So it's basically math. What's your compression ratio? So how many megs per second is your particular video file running? Then find out what the sustained throughput is on the product that you're looking at, and you'll be able to figure out how many streams of video you can get into that box.
There are essentially 3 hard disk manufacturers. There's Western Digital / Hitachi. There's
Yep.
Seagate.
Yep.
There's Toshiba.
Yep.
Why do we care who makes the enclosure?
Patents, for the most part. Well, I'm being tongue-in-cheek, but so, okay, again, without going into all the gory details, right? So Western Digital wanted to buy HDST, already having all these hard drives, and China came in and said you got to run them separately. So essentially, WDC, which is a shell company, owns the 2 divisions.
Division 1 is Hitachi and Division 2 is Western Digital?
Correct. And for anybody wondering why I don't call it Hitachi anymore, when we sold, we're no longer allowed to call it Hitachi, so we took the acronym of HGST. So I'm trying to stick with HGST because my marketing people are like, this is what you have to do. So you've got the HGST brand, and then you've got the WD brand. We run as separate companies, okay? Owned by the same parent company, but completely independent all the way down to the manufacturing process. Now, HGST was originally IBM who invented the hard drive. Like if you ever come to our headquarters, we have this room with this big box, which was like the original hard drive ever, which I think was like in the kilobytes. It wasn't even megs at this point, right? And we've got some unbelievable patents on technology. So from the heads being parked to, when one of our hard drives detects 0 gravity, it knows to park the heads, so you're not going to scratch the surface of the drive, and it's a much more reliable drive. We've got technology in terms of, like our 2 terabyte drive has 4 platters because we want the performance, versus a lot of the competitors will use 2 platters because they just want the price point. And I never shy from this. G-Tech will always be a little bit more expensive, but it's going to last a lot longer. You're going to get much more performance, and I've got all kinds of ways of showing within the first 2 to 3 hours of transfer, you're saving money on our products, right? But each company has a different market share that they're going after, so how they design the drive is going to be reflected in that. So, WD makes an unbelievable drive with massive amount of capacity for much more cost effective, right? But when you're working with video editing or professional content, etc., you need instant access. So that extra 25% performance can make a really big difference if you get the job done on time, if it's going to play back the extra files on time, how often you can do read writes, the reliability, etc., what's going to happen if the drive does drop. And the list goes on and on and on about all the different things you want to take into consideration when looking at the different hard drive manufacturers. That makes sense?
I'm sure you've got tons of questions on your own. Again, what we're going to do is we're going to take a break and give you a chance to go chat with Ian at his booth. Ian Andes is the Vice President of Sales for G Technology. For people that want to learn more about your products, where do they go on the web?
So it's just www.g-technology.com. Or again, you can call the salespeople, and it's a very well-educated team. Almost everybody on the staff has some kind of background in video editing or content creation, professional space. So the guys really know their stuff to get some of the solutions you need.
Ian, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This conversation was recorded at my 4K and Final Cut Pro 10 seminar. For more information, visit larryjordan.biz. And thanks.